The leather chair creaked beneath me as I shifted forward, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had gone white. The law office smelled of old books and expensive cologne, the kind of place that charged by the minute just to breathe their air. Across the mahogany desk, Mr. Whitmore adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat. "I'm afraid there's been a change to your grandmother's will," he said, his voice carrying the practiced neutrality of someone who delivered life-altering news for a living. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." My heart hammered against my ribs. Beside me, my parents sat rigid in their chairs. My father's jaw was clenched, his eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder. My mother fidgeted with her purse strap, the leather worn thin from years of nervous handling. And Ethan, my older brother Ethan, lounged in his chair with the casual confidence of someone who already knew he'd won the lottery. "What kind of change?" I asked, though some primal part of me already knew the way they'd all avoided my eyes when I walked in, the way Ethan had smirked when I sat down. Mr. Whitmore slid a document across the polished surface. "Your grandmother revised her will 6 months before her death. The inheritance, all $4.7 million, goes entirely to your brother." The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the papers, the legal jargon swimming before my eyes. Entirely to Ethan Cruz. Not a penny to Lena Cruz, the granddaughter who'd spent every weekend of her childhood reading to Rosa in Spanish, helping her tend her roses, listening to stories about surviving as an immigrant in a country that didn't want her. "That's not possible," I whispered. "She promised me. She promised both of us would be taken care of equally." Ethan leaned forward, and I caught a whiff of expensive cologne trying to mask something underneath, something chemical and bitter. "Abuela was getting confused near the end, Lena. You saw how she was." I whipped around to face him. At 30, Ethan still had the golden boy looks that had charmed teachers and gotten him out of trouble his entire life. But there were shadows under his eyes now, a gauntness to his cheeks that expensive clothes couldn't hide. "She wasn't confused about this," I said, my voice rising. "She told me just last Christmas that medical school would be paid for, that she wanted to make sure I could become a doctor without drowning in debt." "Lena," my mother's voice was soft, pleading, "your grandmother knew Ethan needed more help. He's been struggling with his issues. This money can save him." Save him. As if the hundreds of thousands they'd already poured into his rehab stints, his legal fees, his fresh starts, hadn't been enough. As if choosing to shoot heroin between his toes was some cosmic misfortune, instead of a choice he made every single day. "What about me?" I demanded. "What about my struggles? I've been working 3 jobs to pay for undergraduate classes. I've been living on ramen and hope, planning my entire future around grandmother's promise." My father finally spoke, his voice as cold as winter steel. "You're 27, Lena. You're capable, self-sufficient. You'll figure it out." "Ethan is 30. "Ethan is sick." The word hung in the air like poison. Sick. As if addiction absolved him of every lie, every theft, every time he disappeared for weeks, leaving us all wondering if we'd find him dead in an alley. As if being sick meant he deserved my future. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat again. "There's documentation supporting the validity of this will. Your grandmother was evaluated by 2 physicians who confirmed her mental capacity at the time of signing." I stared at him, then at my family. "You all knew. You've been planning this." Ethan had the grace to look uncomfortable for exactly 3 seconds before his mask slipped back into place. "It's better this way, Lena. You're smart, you're driven, you don't need a handout." A handout. $4.7 million.
My inheritance, my grandmother's love made tangible, was a handout. "Sign here," Mr. Whitmore said, sliding another document toward me. "This acknowledges your understanding of the will's terms." My hand trembled as I picked up the pen. Around me, my family watched in silence. My mother, with tears in her eyes that I knew weren't for me. My father, with the stern righteousness of a man who believed he was doing the right thing. And Ethan, trying to look grateful while his fingers tapped out a nervous rhythm on his thigh, already thinking about how to spend money that should have been half mine. I signed my name at the bottom of the page, not because I accepted this, not because I forgave them, but because I understood with crystal clarity that I was completely and utterly alone.
As I walked out of that office, my grandmother's rosary heavy in my coat pocket, the only thing of hers I'd managed to keep, I made myself a promise. They thought I didn't need help? They thought I'd figure it out on my own? Fine. I would. And when I did, they'd realize exactly what they'd thrown away. The eviction notice was pink. Such a cheerful color for a document that was about to make me homeless. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed in the studio apartment I can no longer afford, staring at the paper in my hands. 30 days to vacate. The numbers on my laptop screen told the same story my bank account had been telling for months. Medical school tuition was $64,000 a year, and I had $347 to my name. My phone buzzed. A text from Maya, my best friend since high school. Coffee later? Need to vent about my boss. I stared at the message, thumb hovering over the keyboard. How do you tell someone that while they're stressed about office politics, you're rationing packets of instant oatmeal and haven't bought new underwear in 6 months? How do you explain that the girl who graduated valedictorian and got into Johns Hopkins on academic merit alone was about to become another statistic, another bright kid whose dreams died choking on debt? Instead, I typed, rain check. Buried in applications. It wasn't entirely a lie. I had been filling out applications for second jobs, third jobs, anything that would keep me alive long enough to find a way back into school. The coffee shop where I worked mornings had cut my hours, the tutoring gig paid well but wasn't consistent, and the research lab where I worked weekend nights for barely above minimum wage was my only connection to the medical field I was supposed to be studying. Another buzz. This time, it was an email from the financial aid office. Outstanding balance must be resolved before spring registration. I closed the laptop and lay back on the bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of all the places I'd never see. 3 months ago, I'd been a third-year medical student with a 3.9 GPA and acceptance to a competitive neurology residency program. Now I was a dropout with an eviction notice and a family that had written me off as collateral damage in their mission to save my brother. The worst part wasn't the money, though. It was the silence. Radio silence from my parents since the day I'd walked out of the lawyer's office. No calls, no keks, no awkward attempts at family dinners. Just nothing. As if by signing that paper, I'd erased myself from their lives as completely as they'd erased me from grandmother's will. But Ethan felt compelled to share. I scrolled through his Instagram for the 100th time this week, each post a fresh knife twist. The Porsche Cayenne, with new ride, blessed live with a prayer hands emoji. The designer watch collection laid out on marble countertops. The vacation photos from Cabo, him grinning with a martini in one hand and a woman I didn't recognize in the other. $4.7 million, and he was burning through it like kindling. My phone rang, startling me from my masochistic social media spiral. Unknown number, but I answered anyway. These days, any call could be a potential job. Lena? The voice was hesitant, ashamed. My mother. I sat up, my pulse quickening despite myself. Mom? I wanted to see how you were doing. The question was so absurd I almost laughed. How was I doing? I was 3 weeks from homelessness with a medical degree half finished and a family that had sacrificed my future for the pipe dream of saving someone who didn't want to be saved. I'm fine, I lied. Good, I'm glad. A pause, then,
Ethan's in rehab again, a really nice place in Malibu. It costs $60,000 for 30 days, but if it helps him. $60,000. More than a year of medical school tuition spent in a month. That's great, Mom. I hope it works this time. It will, she said, with the desperate conviction of someone who'd said the same thing a dozen times before. He's different this time. He really wants to get clean. I'm sure he does. Another pause. Then, your father thought maybe if you wanted to come to dinner on Sunday, we could talk about what? The words came out sharper than I intended. About how I should be grateful you stole my inheritance to fund another vacation rehab for your golden boy? Lena, that's not fair. You know we love you both equally.
Do I? Because last I checked, love doesn't usually involve leaving your daughter to figure out homelessness while your son posts pictures of his new car. I heard her sharp intake of breath. He needed consequences, Mom. He needed to face what he'd done instead of having Mommy and Daddy clean up every mess with someone else's money. It wasn't someone else's money. It was family money. It was my money. Grandmother promised it to both of us. You knew that, and you took it anyway. Silence stretched between us, filled with years of resentment and words we'd never been brave enough to say. I have to go, I said finally. I have work. I hung up before she could respond and immediately turned my phone face down. Outside my tiny window, the city hummed with life and possibility that felt as distant as the moon. Somewhere out there, people were living the lives they'd planned. Somewhere, families actually took care of each other instead of sacrificing one child for another. But not here. Not for me. I picked up my laptop and opened a new browser tab. If medical school was off the table, I needed to find another way forward. And if my family thought I'd quietly disappear into failure, they were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. The first job listing that caught my eye was at a biotech research lab. Night shift, entry level, no degree required, just willingness to learn and work hard. I started typing my application. Each keystroke a small act of rebellion against the future they'd stolen from me. The laboratory at 3 a.m. was a cathedral of humming machines and blue-white fluorescent light. I moved between the workstations like a ghost, checking cultures, adjusting temperatures, recording data in my careful handwriting. 6 months into this job, and I'd finally stopped feeling like an imposter among the centrifuges and spectrometers. Lena, can you take a look at this? Dr. Adrian Lee stood hunched over a computer terminal, his usually pristine lab coat wrinkled from 12 hours of work. At 34, he was the kind of researcher who forgot to eat when he was onto something interesting, who talked to his cell cultures like they were pets. He was also the only person in this place who treated me like more than just the night shift cleanup crew. I set down my clipboard and walked over, peering at the screen full of data points and statistical analysis. What am I looking at? He said, running a hand through his dark hair. Addiction recovery patterns. We've been tracking relapse rates in our treatment groups, but something's off in the algorithm. The predictive model isn't matching the actual outcomes. I scanned the code, years of undergraduate computer science classes finally proving useful. There, I said, pointing to a line near the bottom. You're using a linear regression model, but addiction recovery isn't linear. People don't get incrementally better. They have good days and catastrophic backslides. You need something that accounts for volatility. Adrian stared at me for a long moment. You know statistical modeling? Heat crept up my neck. I used to be pre-med, had to take biostatistics. Used to be. The words still tasted like failure. Used to be? I shrugged, trying to look casual. Things change. He studied me with the same intensity he brought to his research. Dr. Adrian Lee, I'd learned, was the kind of man who noticed details others missed. How I corrected labeling errors before anyone else caught them. How I stayed late to double-check results, even when I wasn't being paid overtime. How I asked questions that showed I actually understood the science behind what we were doing. Can you fix it?
he asked, gesturing to the screen. I slid into the chair and started typing, my fingers finding their rhythm on the keyboard. It felt good to use my brain for something other than calculating how many packages of ramen I could afford this week. The code flowed like music, each line building on the last until I'd created something elegant and functional. "Try it now," I said, hitting enter. The new analysis ran, and suddenly the data made sense. The predicted outcomes aligned with reality, showing clear patterns in when and why patients struggled. Jesus, that's beautiful. Where did you learn to code like that?
Here and there, online mostly. I didn't mention the sleepless nights in library computer labs teaching myself programming because I couldn't afford textbooks. Why are you studying addiction patterns anyway? His expression darkened, and for a moment, he looked far older than his 34 years. Personal interest. I lost my sister to heroin when she was 23. Mia. She was brilliant. Smarter than me, funnier than anyone I knew. But she got hurt in a car accident, got hooked on pain pills, and when the prescription ran out, he trailed off, staring at the beta on the screen as if it held answers to questions he'd been asking for years. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "The thing is, she tried to get clean, multiple times, but the system is broken. Rehab is expensive, wait lists are long, and even when people get treatment, the relapse rate is astronomical. We're throwing money at the problem without understanding the underlying patterns." Something cold and familiar twisted in my stomach. "Some people get all the chances in the world," I said before I could stop myself. "Others get nothing." Adrian looked at me sharply. "Sounds like you've got some experience with that." I almost told him then. About Ethan, about the inheritance, about watching someone burn through millions of dollars worth of second chances while I scraped together quarters for the laundromat. But vulnerability was a luxury I couldn't afford. Not when I was still figuring out how to survive. "Doesn't everyone?" I said instead. We worked in comfortable silence for the next hour, refining the model, testing different variables. As the sun began to rise outside the lab windows, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, something shifted inside me. For the first time since walking out of that lawyer's office, I felt useful, like I was contributing to something that mattered. "Lena," Adrian said as I gathered my things to leave, "what would you say to collaborating on a research paper? This algorithm you created, it could revolutionize how we approach addiction treatment. We could predict relapse patterns, customize interventions, maybe even prevent some people from falling through the cracks." I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "You want me to co-author a paper with you?" "I want you to co-author a paper with me," he confirmed. "You've got the technical skills, and clearly you understand the human side of this in a way most researchers don't." The human side. If only he knew. "I don't have a degree, I'm just the night shift tech." "Degrees don't create insights like this," he said, gesturing to the screen. "Passion does, intelligence does, and you've got both in spades." As I walked home through the awakening city, Adrian's words echoed in my head. For 6 months, I'd been thinking of this job as a placeholder, a way to pay bills while I figured out how to get back to my real life. But what if this was my real life? What if the thing that had been taken from me, the chance to heal people, could be reclaimed in a different form? I thought about Ethan, probably unconscious in his expensive Malibu rehab, surrounded by therapy horses and meditation gardens paid for with my inheritance. I thought about all the people who'd never get those chances, who'd fall through the cracks because no one cared enough to catch them. Maybe I couldn't become the doctor I'd planned to be, but maybe I could become something else, something better. By the time I reached my tiny apartment, I'd made a decision. I pulled out my laptop and started typing, the words flowing like the code had flowed, like my anger was finally finding productive outlet. A predictive model for addiction recovery, identifying patterns in patient outcomes. It wasn't the future I'd planned, but for the first time in months, it felt like a future worth fighting for.
3 years. That's how long it took for my hands to stop shaking when I presented research findings. 3 years of 18-hour days, of coffee-stained lab coats and presentations delivered on 2 hours of sleep. 3 years of building something from the ashes of what they'd stolen from me. The neural pathway mapping shows consistent patterns across all demographic groups, I said, clicking to the next slide. The conference room was packed with researchers from Johns Hopkins, MIT, Stanford, institutions where I should have been studying if my family hadn't decided my brother's addiction was more important than my education. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, the NIH grant coordinator, leaned forward. Dr. Cruz, your methodology is impressive, but the sample size seems limited for the conclusions you're drawing. It's Ms. Cruz, I corrected quietly. The title I'd never earn, still a fresh wound even after all this time. And you're right about the sample size. That's exactly why we're requesting expanded funding.
Adrian caught my eye from across the table and nodded slightly. In the 3 years since that first late-night coding session, we'd become an unstoppable team. His medical expertise, combined with my technical skills and raw determination, had produced research that was getting attention from major pharmaceutical companies and government agencies alike. But attention didn't pay rent. Recognition didn't buy groceries. I was still working 4 different jobs: the night shift at the lab, weekend data analysis for a consulting firm, tutoring pre-med students online, and freelance coding projects that I completed during whatever hours remained. My apartment was a studio, barely larger than some people's closets, furnished with a mattress on the floor and a desk made from a door balanced on cinder blocks. Maya called it poverty chic. I called it survival. The preliminary results are promising enough to warrant Phase 2 trials, Dr. Hernandez continued, but we'll need to see more robust statistical analysis and peer review before approving the full grant. More work, more time, more nights surviving on vending machine coffee and determination. As the meeting broke up, I gathered my papers with hands that had learned not to tremble anymore. Adrian fell into step beside me as we walked toward the elevator. She's going to approve it, he said confidently. I could see it in her eyes. Maybe. I'd learned not to count on anything, not to build dreams on other people's promises. We'll see. My phone buzzed as we reached the parking garage, a text from an unknown number. Lena, it's Mom. Can you call me? It's about Ethan. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the delete button. In 3 years, they'd reached out exactly 4 times. Always about Ethan, always needing something. Bad news? Adrian asked, reading my expression. Family. I said the phone back into my pocket without responding. He knew better than to push. In all our late-night research sessions, all our shared coffees and collaborative breakthroughs, I'd never told him the whole story. He knew I'd left medical school for financial reasons, knew there was some family drama that I didn't want to discuss, but he didn't know about the inheritance, about the lawyer's office, about watching my brother spend my future on Instagram-worthy vacations. The drive home took me through the old neighborhood, past the house where I'd grown up. I slowed without meaning to, staring at the familiar Spanish tile roof and manicured lawn. Ethan's Porsche was parked in the driveway, a different one than last time. This one was white instead of black, probably because he'd wrecked the first one and used my inheritance money to buy a replacement. Through the front window, I could see warm light in the flicker of the television. Normal family life continuing without the daughter they'd written off as expendable. My phone rang. Maya. Tell me you're not driving past your parents' house again, she said without preamble. I sighed, pulling over to the curb. Maya had an uncanny ability to sense when I was torturing myself. How did you know? Because you always get that hollow sound in your voice after you've been staring at their perfect little life. Lena, you have to stop doing this to yourself. I wasn't staring, I was just punishing yourself for succeeding despite them. Yeah, I know. You do this every time something good happens with your research, as if you don't deserve to be proud of what you've built. Through the phone, I could hear her moving around her apartment, probably making dinner like a normal person with normal working hours. Maya had become a social worker, helping kids navigate the foster system. She understood broken families,
understood the particular pain of being the child who gets sacrificed for the one who's deemed more needy. They texted, I said, about Ethan. Of course they did. Lem'll guess. He's in trouble again and they want you to fix it. I don't know. I didn't respond. Good. Don't. But curiosity was eating at me. What had he done this time? How much of my inheritance was left? The questions turned in my mind like acid, burning away any satisfaction I'd felt from the grant meeting. That night, unable to sleep, I did something I'd sworn I wouldn't do anymore. I checked his social media. The posts had changed over the past few months. Less luxury, more desperation disguised as philosophy. Photos of sunrises with captions about finding himself and spiritual journeys. A picture of him looking gaunt and hollow-eyed with the caption, "The universe is testing me, but I'm stronger than my demons."
The comments were telling. Friends expressing concern, asking if he was okay, offering help. The kind of support system I'd never had when I was sleeping in my car and rationing meals. I closed the app and opened my laptop instead, diving back into the data analysis that never disappointed me, never lied to me, never chose someone else over me. Numbers didn't play favorites. Patterns didn't betray you. By dawn, I'd refined our algorithm to account for 3 new variables that could predict relapse with 89% accuracy. It was groundbreaking work, the kind of innovation that could save thousands of lives and revolutionize addiction treatment. But as I finally crawled into bed while the rest of the world was starting their day, I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter how much I achieved, no matter how many lives I saved, I'd always be that 27-year-old girl sitting in a lawyer's office, watching her family choose her brother's addiction over her dreams. The only difference now was that I was choosing something bigger than both of us. And maybe, eventually, that would be enough. The champagne tasted like vindication. To bioneural dynamics, Adrian raised his glass, his grin so wide it looked like it might split his face in half. Around us, the modest conference room we'd rented for the occasion buzzed with the quiet excitement of people who knew they were witnessing something historic. To the woman who made it all possible, he continued, turning toward me, to Lena Cruz, who saw patterns where the rest of us saw chaos. I felt heat creep up my neck as the small group of investors, researchers, and advisors raised their glasses in my direction. 6 months ago, I'd been just another night shift lab tech with an unfinished degree and a grudge against the world. Now I was the co-founder of a biotech startup that had just secured $12 million in Series A funding. The irony wasn't lost on me. $12 million, almost 3 times what Ethan had inherited from our grandmother. Money I'd earned through sleepless nights and relentless determination instead of manipulation and family favoritism. The clinical trial results speak for themselves, said Jennifer Walsh, the lead investor from Apex Ventures. A sharp woman in her 50s who'd built her career on identifying breakthrough technologies before they became obvious. 92% accuracy in predicting relapse patterns. That's not just impressive, it's revolutionary. Our algorithm had exceeded even my wildest expectations. The neural pathway mapping combined with behavioral analysis and biological markers created a predictive model so accurate it felt like seeing into the future. Doctors could intervene before patients relapsed, adjusting treatment plans in real time based on risk factors our system identified. The FDA fast-track approval is just the beginning, added Adrian, his voice bright with possibility. This technology could be implemented in every addiction treatment facility in the country within 5 years. I sipped my champagne and tried to absorb the magnitude of what we'd accomplished. The girl who'd been written off by her own family had just created something that could save thousands of lives, including people like the brother who'd stolen her future. The meeting broke up with handshakes and business cards, promises of follow-up calls and strategic partnerships. As the last investor left, I found myself alone in the conference room with Adrian, both of us staring at the presentation slides still glowing on the wall screen. "Holy shit," he said finally. "We actually did it." "Language, Dr. Lee," I teased, but I was grinning too. "What would your medical school professors think?" "They'd think I'm incredibly lucky to have found the most brilliant research partner on the planet." I deflected the compliment with a wave of my hand, but something warm unfurled in my chest. Acceptance. Recognition. The kind of validation I'd been craving since that day in the lawyer's office when my family had looked at everything I had accomplished and decided it wasn't enough. My phone buzzed. A text from Maya. "Saw the TechCrunch article. Holy shit, you're famous. Drinks tonight?" "Article?"
I pulled out my laptop and Googled my name, something I had trained myself never to do. The first result made my breath catch. From lab tech to biotech founder, how Lena Cruz is revolutionizing addiction treatment. The article included a photo from today's press conference, me standing next to Adrian, both of us holding champagne flutes and looking like we just conquered the world, which, in a way, we had. Cruz's journey from night shift laboratory technician to biotech entrepreneur reads like a Silicon Valley fairy tale, but with a crucial difference. Her innovation has the potential to save lives on a massive scale. We're not just building a product, Cruz told reporters, we're building hope for families who've been trapped in the cycle of addiction. Families trapped in the cycle of addiction. The journalist had no idea how personal those words were. How many nights I'd lain awake wondering if my research could have saved Ethan if he'd wanted to be saved. Another notification popped up. A LinkedIn message from someone at Harvard Medical School, inviting me to speak at their annual innovation symposium. Then another from a reporter at
Wall Street Journal, requesting an interview. Then a dozen more from colleagues, acquaintances, people I hadn't heard from in years, suddenly eager to congratulate me on my success. It was intoxicating and overwhelming and terrifying all at once. "You okay?" Adrian asked, watching me scroll through the messages with growing concern. "It's just a lot," I said. 6 months ago, I was nobody. Now suddenly, everyone wants to talk to me. "You were never nobody," he said firmly. "You just weren't visible yet. There's a difference." His words hit deeper than I expected. Not visible. That had been my entire childhood, hadn't it? The responsible daughter who didn't cause problems, who didn't need saving, who could be safely ignored while all the attention went to the crisis of the week. But I was visible now, whether I was ready for it or not. As we packed up our materials and prepared to leave, I caught my reflection in the conference room window. The woman staring back looked confident, successful, and complete. She looked like someone who'd never been told she wasn't worth a $4.7 million inheritance. Someone who'd never slept in her car or rationed ramen packets. She looked like someone who'd won. But winning, I was learning, came with its own complications. Success made you a target, made people notice you in ways that weren't always comfortable. And somewhere out there, my family was probably reading the same articles, seeing the same photos, realizing that the daughter they'd discarded had built something extraordinary from the wreckage they'd left behind. Part of me wondered if they'd reach out, if success would finally make me worthy of their attention. Another part of me, the part that had learned to survive on determination and spite, hoped they wouldn't dare. Because this victory was mine alone, built from nothing, earned through sacrifice, powered by the anger they'd given me when they chose my brother's addiction over my dreams. And it was just the beginning. The TMZ article was titled, "Tech CEO's Brother Arrested in $1 Million Art Fraud." The photo showed Ethan in handcuffs, his once golden face gaunt and hollow, being led out of a Beverly Hills gallery by federal agents. I stared at my laptop screen in my corner office, actual corner office with windows and everything, trying to process what I was reading. According to the article, he'd been running a sophisticated con involving fake Picasso sketches, using his charm and what remained of his inheritance money to convince wealthy collectors they were getting exclusive deals on recently discovered masterpieces. The scheme had netted him nearly $2 million before an art expert noticed inconsistencies in the provenance documents. By then, he'd already spent most of it on cocaine, gambling, and maintaining the lifestyle that had initially made him credible to his marks. My phone rang. "Mom." I let it go to voicemail, then immediately played the message. "Lena, I know you're busy with your company and everything, but we need to talk. Ethan's in serious trouble, and the lawyers say he needs bail money. A lot of bail money. My father and I have already mortgaged the house, but it's not enough. She broke. We need your help." I deleted the message and went back to reading the article. The comments section was brutal. Rich kid thinks he can buy his way out of anything. Hope he rots in jail. Another spoiled brat who never learned the word no. Parents probably enabled him his whole life. My brother struggled with addiction too, but he never turned to fraud. There's a difference between sick and criminal. They weren't wrong. Ethan had crossed a line that addiction couldn't excuse, had moved from self-destruction to actively harming others. The collectors he defrauded were mostly wealthy enough to absorb the losses, but that didn't make it right. My assistant knocked on the door. "Lena, there are some people here to see you. They say they're family?" Through the glass walls of my office, I could see them in the reception area. My parents, looking older and smaller than I remembered, huddled together on the sleek modern furniture like refugees in a foreign country. My father's hair had gone completely gray, and my mother clutched a handbag that I recognized as the knockoff Coach she'd bought at a swap meet years ago. "Send them in," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. They walked into my office like they were entering a courtroom, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows, the awards on the walls, and the Harvard Business Review cover story featuring my face that I'd had framed more as a fuck you to the universe than out of actual vanity. "Lena," my mother said, and her voice was smaller than I remembered, worn thin by years of crisis management. "You look successful."
I am successful, I replied, not getting up from behind my desk. The power dynamic felt important somehow, a reversal of every family dinner where I'd been made to feel like an afterthought. "Please, sit." They perched on the edge of the chairs across from me, and I was struck by how diminished they looked. These people had once seemed so powerful, so certain of their righteousness when they'd stolen my inheritance and justified it as love. Now they looked like what they were. Parents who'd spent 30 years enabling an addict and had finally run out of resources. "We saw the article," my father said, cutting straight to the point as always, "about Ethan." "I imagine you did. It's hard to miss when your son makes TMZ for all the wrong reasons." He flinched at the coldness in my voice. "He made mistakes. He committed fraud. Federal fraud. There's a difference." My mother leaned forward, tears already starting to fall. "He's sick, Lena. The addiction, it makes him do things he wouldn't normally do."
This time, he would face the consequences alone. And maybe, finally, that would be enough to save him. Or maybe it wouldn't. But either way, it was no longer my problem to solve. The conference room felt different this time. Same mahogany table, same leather chairs, same floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seattle skyline. But 8 years ago, I'd sat here as a supplicant, watching my dreams get redistributed to fund someone else's destruction. Now, I sat at the head of the table, while my family shuffled in like defendants approaching sentencing. Ethan looked like hell. Prison orange had been replaced by a wrinkled button-down that hung loose on his diminished frame. But the real change was in his eyes. Gone was the golden boy confidence, the smirk that said the world owed him everything. What remained was hollow desperation and the kind of exhaustion that came from finally running out of people to manipulate. My parents flanked him like bodyguards, but they looked just as defeated. Dad's construction business, the one built by my grandfather's immigrant hands, was hemorrhaging money. Mom's face showed the strain of 8 years spent choosing Ethan over everything else, including her own dignity. "Thank you for seeing us," my mother said, her voice barely above a whisper. The confident woman who'd once told me I was young and unattached, and therefore expendable, had been replaced by someone who looked like she'd aged decades in the past few years. I didn't respond immediately.
Instead, I let the silence stretch. Let them marinate in their discomfort while I reviewed the documents my private investigator had compiled. Every mortgage, every loan, every desperate financial decision they'd made trying to keep Ethan afloat. "You have 5 minutes," I said finally, echoing the words my father had used when I'd begged them not to steal my inheritance. "Starting now." Dad cleared his throat, trying to summon his old authority. "Lena, we know things have been strained between us, but family is family." "Is it?" I asked, not looking up from my papers. "Because last I checked, family doesn't usually involve grand theft and emotional abandonment." "We never stole anything," Ethan started, but I cut him off with a look that could have frozen blood. "Shut up," I said quietly. "You've done enough talking for several lifetimes." He recoiled as if I had slapped him, and I felt a cold satisfaction at seeing him flinch. The golden boy who'd once commanded every room he entered now couldn't even maintain eye contact. "The federal conviction carries a minimum of 7 years, but that's just the beginning. The civil suits from your fraud victims are seeking triple damages. The IRS has filed liens for unpaid taxes on the money you stole and never reported. And the state of California wants their cut of the art sales you failed to properly document." Mom started crying silently, tears streaming down cheeks that had aged into deep lines of worry and regret. "We've lost everything," Dad said, his voice cracking on the words. "The house, the business, our retirement, everything we built, everything your grandfather left us, it's all gone. We're living in a studio apartment above Maya's old dance studio, surviving on Social Security and food stamps." The irony was perfect. They were now experiencing the poverty I'd lived through when they'd stolen my inheritance, the desperation of having nowhere to turn and no one who cared. "And you want what, exactly?" "Help," Mom whispered. "The lawyers say there might be a way to reduce Ethan's sentence if we can make full restitution to his victims, but it would take millions we don't have." "Help with what else?" Dad swallowed hard. "We can't make the rent, can't afford Ethan's legal fees for the appeals, we can't survive like this, Lena. We're drowning." I leaned back in my chair, studying their faces. These people had once held absolute power over my life, had made decisions about my future with the casual cruelty of gods deciding who lived and who died. Now they sat before me like beggars, hoping for mercy from the daughter they'd written off as expendable. "Let me make sure I understand," I said slowly. "You want me to pay millions to help the man who stole my inheritance avoid the consequences of his crimes? You want me to support the parents who chose his addiction over my education, his comfort over my future? You want me to rescue the family that abandoned me when I needed help, that never once called to see if I was okay when I was sleeping in my car and eating ramen for every meal?" "You don't understand what it's like," Mom said desperately. "He's sick. He's a criminal," I interrupted. "There's a difference. And you're his enablers. You spent 8 years and millions of dollars teaching him that actions don't have consequences, that family—"
Mom started crying again, but these weren't the desperate tears of earlier. These were the tears of someone finally understanding the true cost of 8 years of enabling and willful blindness. "And if we do sign?" she asked. "Then Ethan serves his reduced sentence, probably 4 years instead of 7. You live quietly in a modest apartment I'll provide with enough income to cover your basic needs. The family name gets dragged through the mud during his trial, but you avoid criminal liability yourselves." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Most importantly, you'll finally face the consequences of choosing his addiction over everything else. No more house to mortgage for his legal fees. No more business to leverage for his bail bonds. No more assets to liquidate every time he needs rescuing. Dad's hands trembled as he reached for the pen. This is revenge. No, I said firmly. Revenge would be letting you rot in federal prison while I bought up your debts for pennies on the dollar. Revenge would be making sure Ethan served the maximum sentence while you lost everything anyway. This is justice, tempered with more mercy than you ever showed me. The irony is perfect, isn't it? I continued, watching him sign each page with the mechanical precision of someone who'd finally accepted defeat. 8 years ago, you sat in a room like this and redistributed my inheritance to fund his destruction. Today, I'm redistributing what's left of your assets to clean up the mess you made. Mom signed next, her signature barely legible through her tears. Finally, Ethan took the pen, his hand shaking so badly he could barely form letters. "I'm sorry," he whispered as he finished the last signature. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry for everything." I looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since they'd walked into the room. The golden boy was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of addiction and failure. Part of me felt pity for the man he might have been if our parents had loved him enough to let him face consequences years ago. Sorry doesn't restore the $4.7 million you burned through. Sorry doesn't give me back the years I spent believing my family might actually care about me. Sorry doesn't undo the choice you made to take what was mine and use it to fund your self-destruction. I gathered the signed documents and closed the portfolio. But it's a start.
Grandma Rosa had always believed in second chances, but she'd also believed in consequences. She'd immigrated to this country with nothing, built a life through determination and sacrifice, and left her fortune to her granddaughters because she wanted us to have opportunities she'd never had. Instead, her money had funded 8 years of destruction, enabling instead of empowering. Now it would do what she'd intended all along, create possibilities for people willing to fight for them. "Have you heard from them?" Maya asked. I shook my head. My parents were living in the one-bedroom apartment I'd arranged for them in a modest but safe neighborhood. They received enough money each month to cover rent, groceries, and basic expenses, about what I'd lived on during my poorest years as a graduate student. Ethan was serving his 4-year sentence at a minimum security federal prison, attending mandatory addiction counseling that might actually help him this time, since he no longer had family money to fall back on. Do you want to hear from them? That was the question I'd been avoiding for months. Part of me still craved their acknowledgement, their apology, some sign that they finally understood what they'd cost me, but another part, the part that had built a multi-million-dollar company from spite and determination, knew that their validation would never be enough to fill the hole their betrayal had carved in my life. I don't know, I admitted. I used to think I'd feel satisfied when they finally faced consequences, but watching them sign away everything they'd built, it just felt hollow. "That's because revenge never feels as good as you think it will," said Maya. "But this," she gestured toward the construction crew installing solar panels on the roof, "this is different. This is legacy." Legacy. The word settled in my chest like a key finding its lock. I thought about all the women who would find help here, all the children who wouldn't have to grow up watching a parent destroy themselves with addiction, all the families who might be saved from the cycle that had consumed mine. My phone buzzed. A text from Dr. Adrian Lee. "Clinical trial results are in. 94% success rate with the new intervention protocol. We're going to save so many lives, Lena." 94%. Our addiction treatment algorithm, refined and improved over 8 years of research, was now being used in hospitals and treatment facilities across the country. The pain my family had caused me had been transformed into something that prevented other families from experiencing the same destruction. "I need to get back to the office," I said, finishing my coffee. "Board meeting in an hour." As we walked toward our cars, Maya touched my arm. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. All of it. Taking back what was yours, making them face reality, and then choosing to build something good from the wreckage." I looked back at the house one more time. In 6 months, it would be full of women fighting for their lives, children learning that addiction didn't have to define their futures, families healing from the wounds that substances and enabling had created. It wasn't the justice I'd once dreamed of, dramatic and satisfying and final. It was something quieter and more complex. The transformation of poison into medicine, of generational trauma into generational healing. Grandma Rosa would have been proud. As I drove back to my office, past the Seattle skyline that had witnessed my rise from a homeless graduate student to a successful entrepreneur, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. Peace. Not the peace of revenge completed or scores settled, but the peace of purpose fulfilled. I'd finally found a way to honor my grandmother's legacy and my own pain, turning what had been stolen from me into something that could never be taken away. And maybe in the end, that was worth more than any inheritance could ever be. The roses were in full bloom. I stood before the entrance to the Rosa Cruz Recovery Center, breathing in the sweet fragrance of the climbing roses that now covered the archway where my childhood home's front door used to be. Pink peace roses, the same variety Grandma Rosa taught me to tend in her garden 30 years ago when I was 7 years old and believed that love was unconditional and families were forever. "Miss Cruz, we're ready for you," said the photographer from Seattle Magazine, adjusting her lens to capture the moment. Behind her, a small crowd had gathered. City officials, healthcare administrators, some of the women who would be the center's first residents, and Maya, who stood near the back with tears already streaming down her cheeks. I held the oversized scissors, their weight familiar in my hands. 10 years ago, I'd signed papers that signed away my inheritance with trembling fingers. Today, my hands were steady as I prepared to cut the ribbon on something worth infinitely more than the $4.7 million my family had stolen from me. "This center represents more than addiction treatment," I said, addressing the small crowd. The words came easily now, polished by months of interviews and presentations.
Second chances aren't just for the women who will find healing here, but for all of us who believe that our worst moments don't have to define our future. The cameras flashed as I cut through the red ribbon, but my mind wasn't on the ceremony. Instead, I was remembering another afternoon, another garden, another version of myself who believed the world was fair and love was enough. "Mira, mija," Grandma Rosa had said, her weathered hands guiding my small ones as we planted roses along her garden fence. "These thorns, they protect the flower. But without the thorns, birds would eat the buds before they could bloom. Sometimes the painful things, they make us stronger." I'd been 7, skinning my knees on her gravel driveway and crying over playground bullies who made fun of my second-hand clothes. She dried my tears with her apron and taught me to see beauty in struggle, strength in survival. "Prométeme algo, Lenisa," she'd said that day, her accent still thick after 40 years in America. "Prométeme you'll remember that roses grow best in thorny places. The most beautiful flowers, they come from the hardest ground." I'd promised, not understanding then that she was teaching me a lesson I'd need for survival. The ceremony moved inside, where the local news crew was setting up for interviews. The main living area, once our family room, where I'd done homework while Ethan monopolized our parents' attention, had been transformed into a bright, welcoming space with comfortable seating and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in natural light. The dining room, where I'd been told I was expendable, now housed a computer lab where women could learn job skills while their children played in the adjacent childcare center. "Dr. Cruz," said the reporter from King 5 News, her microphone already live. I had stopped correcting people who called me doctor. The PhD in biostatistics I'd earned through night school while building my company felt as valid as any medical degree. More so, maybe, because I'd earned it despite everyone who'd tried to stop me. "Tell us about your grandmother's influence on this project." I touched the small rose pin on my lapel, the one piece of jewelry I wore every day. "My grandmother, Rosa, immigrated here with nothing but determination and love for her family. She believed in second chances, but she also believed in earning them. This center embodies both of those principles." "Your brother's addiction played a role in your family losing their inheritance," the reporter continued. "Was that experience part of your motivation for focusing on women's recovery services?" The question should have stung, but it didn't. Time had filed down the sharp edges of that pain, transforming it into something useful. Addiction doesn't just destroy the person using drugs. It destroys families, communities, futures that might have been.
but I've learned that sometimes destruction clears the ground for something better to grow. After the interviews ended and the crowd dispersed, I found myself alone in the center's meditation garden. Maya had planted it in the backyard where our old swing set used to stand, creating a quiet space with benches arranged in a circle around a fountain. At its center, she'd planted a single rose bush, not climbing roses like the ones at the entrance, but a compact bush that would bloom repeatedly throughout the season. The plaque in its base read, "In memory of Rosa Esperanza Cruz, who taught us that the most beautiful flowers grow in the most challenging soil." I sat on one of the benches and pulled out my phone, scrolling through the messages that had poured in since the news coverage aired. Congratulations from colleagues, gratitude from addiction counselors, interview requests from national media outlets. One message made me pause. An LinkedIn notification from Harvard Medical School offering me an honorary doctorate and inviting me to deliver their commencement address. Dr. Lena Cruz, they wanted to call me. The title I'd never earned in the traditional way, but had claimed through years of research that was now saving lives across the country. Another message caught my eye, this one from an email address I didn't recognize. "I saw the news story about your recovery center. My daughter is struggling with addiction and we don't know where to turn. Is there a waiting list?" I forwarded it to the center's intake coordinator, adding a note about scholarship funding for families who couldn't afford treatment. That was the beauty of what I'd built. It was self-sustaining, funded by patents from my research, and managed by people who understood that recovery required more than just medical treatment. It required community, purpose, hope. As the sun began to set behind the Seattle skyline, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, I closed my eyes and whispered the words I'd been carrying for months. "Thank you, Abuela, for the thorns and the roses. Both." Somewhere in the city, my parents were probably eating dinner in their small apartment, watching the news coverage of their daughter's success with whatever combination of pride and regret they'd learned to live with. Ethan was in his federal prison cell, perhaps finally understanding that the consequences he'd avoided his entire life had always been waiting for him. They were no longer my responsibility, no longer my pain to carry. I'd spent years believing that my worth was tied to their recognition, their approval, their love. But sitting in this garden built on the ruins of their choices, I finally understood the truth. I'd never needed their inheritance to prove my value. I'd never needed their validation to know who I was.
The girl who'd been told she was expendable had grown into a woman who was indispensable to her research team, to the thousands of patients whose lives had been saved by her algorithms, to the women who would find healing in this space that had once housed so much dysfunction. I stood up, brushing imaginary dust from my dress, and walked toward the exit. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to transform pain into purpose. But tonight, for the first time in 37 years, I felt complete. The roses would bloom here long after I was gone, their beauty emerging from soil that had been enriched by struggle, watered by tears, tended by hands that understood the value of both thorns and flowers. And that, I realized, was the only inheritance that truly mattered. My name is Lena Cruz. I'm 37 years old, a biotech CEO and founder of the Rosa Cruz Recovery Center. This is the story of how my family stole my inheritance and how that theft led me to something infinitely more valuable than money could ever buy. Sometimes the most beautiful flowers really do grow in the most challenging soil. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.